that, I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, Sherry Weppel. Sherry is the Director of E-Learning and Training Development for GP Strategies. She has over 15 years experience designing, developing, and delivering interactive computer-based and web-based learning modules. Her role is to drive innovative ISD techniques into processes and provide valuable input on the state of learning and best-in-class practices. Sherry recently completed her MS in Learning Sciences and Technology with a focus in gaming for instruction at Lehigh University. She has also earned an MS in Instructional Design and Development from Lehigh University and a BS in Art Education from Kutztown University. So with that, Sherry, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kayla, and thanks to all of you who are joining us today. Today we want to talk about something that to me is really exciting. You know, my heart is in instructional design. My heart's always been in instructional design, and one of the things that as an instructional designer I love to do is analysis. And, you know, I think it's the most fun and engaging part of developing a curriculum is getting to sit down and getting to map out you know, how we're going to go about creating the curriculum, what that's going to look like, and really focusing on what the learner experience is like. But if any of you or like any of the people that we work with, sometimes that's not possible. You know, we look at the ADDIE model and we look at all the different phases of the ADDIE model, and oftentimes as we're engaged at GP, we focus on the design and the development aspects of things. You know, oftentimes we're forced by constraints of budget, by constraints of time, by constraints of speeds of market to kind of fast forward through that analysis phase and do what's worked in the past. You know, maybe do something that we've seen before, but oftentimes we have to skip that really rich analysis phase. What we want to explore today is maybe that's not necessary. You know, maybe analysis doesn't have to be this lengthy activity. Maybe we can do it a little bit of a different way and get some of those same results, but in a much faster time frame. So what we're going to talk today is just about the analysis portion. So when we think about analysis, what we're really focusing on is trying to determine what does the learner need. You know, what key pieces of content are they going to need to be able to discover? Where is all the source material, or where is all of this content coming from? And who are the people that we need to be in contact with? So we're thinking about executive stakeholders, we're thinking about decision makers, subject matter experts. These are all the different types of people who we need to engage with to kind of make some of these decisions. Typically when we think about analysis, in a full-blown analysis, it might take us 8 hours of analysis to get to 1 hour worth of content. So if you do the math, if we're putting together a larger scale training initiative, that's a lot of a time investment that maybe we don't have. So what we looked to put together was a way of doing things a little bit differently. You know, some of the other challenges that we have from an analysis perspective is if you think about your subject matter experts, you think about maybe your executive stakeholders, depending on who they are, they may not come from a training background. So for them to participate in the conversation can also be a lot of frustration that they might feel because they don't know a lot of the training lingo that you may be using. So when we think about this analysis process, we want to think about really boiling it down to what do we want the learner to know, and what do we want that experience to look like? We use what I refer to as the building blocks of training. So when we think about a specific piece of content, you know, let's say, for example, we want to talk about the culture within your organization. There's 4 different phases of instruction that we may go through for any specific content. So we may want to inform them of something, and most often, whenever we're doing any kind of a training initiative, we're going to be informing the learner of something. Whether it's an awareness that a certain topic exists, whether it's an awareness of an initiative, whether it's awareness of what they're going to learn, there should be something that's kind of setting the stage and informing the learner of what's to come. For some time, the training really stops there. Other times, we're going to continue to define additional pieces of information. So we may inform them that there's culture and that this is the culture of your organization, but then we're going to define what are those elements of the culture that they need to be aware of. As we start to define, we want to make sure that we're not just giving them information. We want to make sure that we're not just pushing that information to our learners. There's going to be other situations where we're going to want them to be able to practice that skill. So think about sales training, think about anything that might be role-based, application-based. We may want them to get some practice on the job, to practice the skills that they were just instructed on, to practice putting some of the definitions that we've given them, some of the things that we've informed, and kind of bring that to life and bring that to their everyday job experience. And then we may get to the last phase, which is apply, which is, for some of the more serious and mission-critical types of information, we want to make sure that they're able to do it and that we're confident that they're doing it successfully before we kind of release them out into the world. So as we start to boil it down, these are things that, I find a lot of subject matter experts and a lot of people who may not have a background in training can really grasp a hold of. They can get to the point where, I think we need to inform them of this, I think we need to define them of this, but, maybe we don't need to get to practice, maybe we don't need to get to apply. So it's really distilling things down to what do the learners really need, and what do we need to focus on in our training solution. As we start to look at that, we then want to start to boil it down to what is that learner experience going to be. So are they going to see 15 hours of e-learning? Are they going to sit in a 2-week instructor-led training course? My hope is that all of you on the phone are horrified by the things that I've just said and are shaking your head vigorously no. We want to use a lot of different modalities. We want to change up the experience for that learner so that they're getting a lot of different types of content, but that we also want to be very prescriptive in how we're using content. So what you see on the screen is a sampling of some of the different types of modalities that we can put together, and you can see that they're color-coded. So if we go back a slide, we have the blue as the inform, we have the green as the define, the orange is practice, and the gray is apply. As we look at those modalities, you can see that we've mapped specific modalities to the specific type of training or type of knowledge we're trying to impart. So that helps us kind of break down the choices of what kinds of training we might want to use, and then we can really focus on the content, which is where the SMEs are going to be really our biggest benefit because they know the content like nothing else. So what we're really trying to do is to provide them with a tool that we can help them have that conversation with us. So as we break down inform, we break it down one step further into basic, medium, and advanced. Now, basic, medium, and advanced can be for a couple of different reasons. So something could be basic because it's something that's very easy to produce. So maybe we know that as we're informing the learners of something, it's something that's going to change frequently. So we don't really want to invest a lot of time and a lot of effort in creating a training component. We want to do something very, very quick. We want to get it out there because we know it's going to be disposed of within 6 months. It's not going to be used anymore. Maybe it's basic because there's not a whole lot of specific information that they need to be aware of. So maybe it's just a quick reference card. It's something that they just need to have a one-pager that they're aware of, and that's it. Maybe it's something that's medium, and when I classify that as medium, it means that it's probably going to stand a little bit more of the test of time. It may be reused a little bit, but it still does have a definite shelf life to it. We use something called an infomercial, which is really just a fancy name for a video that's created using animation and using different types of graphical treatments instead of a live action video. Maybe that's a tool that we can use to inform the learner of whatever the curriculum is or whatever the knowledge is that they're about to receive. As we head down into advanced, we want to be careful with the advanced formats because while they're very dynamic and they're very engaging, they also typically take a little bit more time to put together. So we want to be very thoughtful in how we use those advanced formats. So for example, a pre-assessment, while very simple to produce, if you're using that to have a learner opt out of a curriculum, you want to be very careful about what questions you're asking. A video is something that's going to take a little bit more time to produce, but you want to think about things that you're going to be able to reuse across different curriculum. So maybe there's a video that you're informing the learners of culture and values. So that would be a great use of a video, because you're going to be able to use that across multiple new hire curriculums potentially in your organization. So as we start to explore the inform, we start to look at this basic, medium, and advanced and start to think about the specific choices that we might be making as we start to examine a curriculum. We then move into define, and I'm not going to go into each of these specifically, but we again have that same basic, medium, and advanced. So we have a trainfomercial, which is a lot like an infomercial, except for the fact that it's longer and it's going into more details than just informing the learner of something. We have job-based, which again is like a quick reference card, but is longer, again, with more details. So these are all things that have a little bit of a longer format. They have different types of modalities that are going to give you different information in different manners. But again, we're driving down into more details as we go through it. The medium, we have an interactive PDF, which sounds exactly like it sounds. It's a PDF, so it's just a regular PDF document, but the learner is able to click within that document to reveal more information, to potentially be able to route themselves through the document by clicking on buttons to get role-specific information. There's lots of different ways that they're going to be able to navigate through that document. We have ebooks, we have medium e-learning, we have games, which could either be classroom-based or could be online. We have reference guides that are going to be considered advanced because there's going to be a lot of content in there. And then we also have mobile for instruction. So I do see that we do have a question, so that's great. What the question is what's the differentiating factor between basic, medium, and advanced? So the big factors go into the reusability and the shelf life. So you might do basic for something that's going to be very quick. You might do advanced for something that's going to stand the test of time. It could also be because of the complexity of the solution. So something might be basic because it's something that could be produced very quickly. It might be advanced because it's going to take more time, and it's a more complicated solution. Basic, medium, and advanced also typically correspond to price as well. So as we start thinking about the costs associated with the production of the training solution, we have to start thinking about that at times too. So if we have something that maybe is not really important, maybe it's not mission critical, we might choose something from a basic category instead of something for an advanced. So it's a consideration that we kind of think through as we go through the rapid design process. When it comes to practice, we're going to shift from asynchronous deliverables typically to more of a synchronous deliverable. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to have everybody in the same room. These could still be done virtually. These could still be done, technically they still could be done asynchronously with some sort of a social media platform that they'd be able to collaborate in a social learning environment. As we start to look at these, basic might be a VILT, so maybe you're getting your participants together to roll through some case studies in breakout sessions. Maybe you have a lab exercise or something that they're going to practice on the job with a mentor. As we get into medium, we might have ILT, but here when we talk about instructor-led training, no longer are we talking about having a facilitator stand in the front of the classroom and talk at the learners. We're really trying to get them to have those ILT sessions be engaging, be dynamic, be question and answer, be working through problems together. We want to take all of that didactic content and move that into the first two types of modalities, the inform and define. We may have group activities, hands-on exercises. We may have some advanced e-learning if there's something that we really need that's kind of complex. It might be role-based. It might be practical application. Again, we'll have role plays and on-the-job training or OJT. So these are, again, we're trying to practice what they've learned, so we're not giving them information at this point in time, but we're showing them how it applies to what they do every day. When it comes to apply, there's really only one. This is the capstone exercise. Typically what you would see in a capstone exercise would be a lot like an OJT, but there'd be an assessment portion to it. So think there might be a rubric that allows the supervisor or the manager to be able to assess the learner and make sure that they're completing things properly, and make sure that there's repeatability across participants or across learners. So this is where if you have a lot of those practice sessions, a lot of those virtual on-the-job training type activities, this is where you can really make sure that every mentor is treating their learner or assessing their learner in the same fashion by creating a capstone exercise that's going to assess everyone the same based on a rubric and based on criteria. So this is something that you might not do for every single topic, but you may have something that wraps up maybe a branch of a curriculum. So that was a lot of information, and I promise we're going to get to the fun part next. Things that we need to remember are basic formats are things that are going to be easily edited for frequently changing content. So if you know that you have something that is an application that gets a rollout every 6 months, if you know that you have something that's going to go through a propensity of change over the course of a year, you're going to want to stick to those more basic formats because those are going to be easy for you to make quick updates. As we think about medium formats, those are going to be more engaging, and they're for content that's more sustainable. That doesn't mean that medium formats are not editable. Oftentimes it's something that's done in an articulate storyline. It's something that's done in PowerPoint. It's something that's still done in an editable format, but it's a little bit more complicated than your basics. Last are the advanced formats are best for reusable content that has a long shelf life. Those are where you want to get the most bang for your buck. Those are where you want to create something that's going to really have a longevity to it. It's a really critical message. Some of your change management may come in those advanced formats because you want to make sure that your message comes through and that it's received properly. So now we get to the fun part of the process, and I get to start with a little story. So we have analysis sessions all the time, and oftentimes it can be very challenging for the participants because you all are coming from different places and maybe different experiences, and so some of the information that I just told you was new. So if you can imagine being someone who doesn't come from a training background, all of that information was new. To have them participate in a discussion with training people in the room can be very frustrating for them because they're having to recall all of that information very, very quickly. We definitely don't want to keep our SMEs frustrated. We want to make sure that they're engaged. We want to make sure that they feel important and that they feel valued. We also want to use their time most effectively. So when we thought about how to do this, we thought about making this a little bit more of an engaging process, so it's not just us asking a series of questions. Oftentimes when we have a customer who comes to us and wants to do an analysis, at a bare minimum, they know what they want to instruct. What are the topics that they need to hit? They may have a curriculum already in place that they're just revamping or revising, but at a bare minimum, people know what people need to know to do their job. So what we did was we developed these flashcards. And at first, I've had teams of engineers go through this process and go, flashcards, really? I'm an engineer. I can do so much better than that. I don't need flashcards. And then, about 45 minutes later, you see them holding their flashcards up in the air, making their selections, and really getting engaged in the process, and it's really exciting. So let's dive into what this process looks like. So picture you're in a room, and this can be for a group of 5 people. This can be for a group of 20 people. Depending on how you have your facilitator working the room, this could be for more people than that. Everyone has the stacks of cards in front of them. So you have a stack of your informed cards, and there's one for each of those modalities we just talked about. You have your stack of define, you have your stack of practice, and you have your stack of apply. And the facilitator is going to start with asking a very important question. So one of the things that we have on our list is the culture of your organization. And what does the learner need to know when it comes to culture of an organization? So you're going to ask them, do they need to be informed of what the culture is? Do they need to have the culture or values defined for them? So do they need to know the specific culture and values that they're being held accountable for? Is culture and values something that they need to practice? Or is culture and values something that we need to assess them on? So as we kind of talk through the room, we ask them to set aside the parts of the deck that they don't think apply. So if they don't think there's apply or they don't think there's practice to it, we're going to ask them to set those off to the side for now. We're then left with the inform and define. So what we want them to do is we can say, okay, let's start with inform, and let's lay your cards out and think about what would you do from an informed perspective. How would you educate the learner using the different modalities that are available from Inform? So as I lay these cards out, kind of think to yourself, which of these different modalities that we have talked about would you want to use to convey to your learners what the culture and value of your organization is? Now, if you're a subject matter expert, you may be sitting there going, oh my gosh, I don't remember what any of these things are. What's a knowledge check? What's an infomercial? I don't understand. And that's why on the back of these cards, they have the ability to click at any point in time and look into the details of what the specific modality is. So it provides them with the ability to save face and not feel as if they're a fish out of water, and be able to click through all of these or flip over these flashcards, because these are actually happening in person. They can flip through these flashcards and be able to see on the back, oh, that's what a knowledge check is. The details on the back go into an explanation of what the modality is, and then it goes into what they're specifically best for. So it kind of gives them a cheat sheet. What we ask the learner to then do is we have everybody go around the room and have a volunteer say, well, I think it should be a knowledge check, and here's why. I think it should be an infomercial, and here's why. And then we get into a rich dialogue as everyone defends their choices. When we wind up with the final curriculum map, is that the exact curriculum map we wind up with? Probably not. You know, we go back and we revise things, and we take a step back, and a couple of days later go back and take a look at it again. You know, one of the things that we often get into is people wind up getting kind of hung up on a card where all of a sudden everything is an interactive PDF. So at times we ask them to set that card aside for a little while as they go through the next couple of topics to make sure that we're getting the diversified instruction. But it gives us a really good benchmark to start with and to start the dialogue with. So here's a little case study of how we've done things in the past. You know, this is one of the first times we used this approach, and it was a very successful rollout. And you can see that what we wound up with was, instead of that 6 hours of e-learning or the 15 hours of ILT, we wound up with an infomercial, we wound up with a job aid, some medium e-learning, an interactive PDF. We wound up with some hands-on exercises. We wound up with a really diversified program that gave a lot of different modalities to learners so that they had a really rich and full experience. You know, it's really cool whenever we do get to see this, just all the different excitement that we see in the room, the different ideas that people are coming up with, and just the different approaches that we can come up with, and the really cool instruction that we can create for these learners so that they're getting a lot of different content in a lot of different ways. So one of the questions that I just had was, what do you do if not all your stakeholders or experts agree on one informed, define, practice, and apply? Do you still just move forward and discuss modality options? Absolutely. So rare is it that you can manage to get through an entire curriculum redesign or entire curriculum design and not have some challenges. But that's really where we get to work our magic. So it's where we get to have that conversation and have the rich dialogue to talk about the different options and the pros and cons of them. And typically we can usually come to some sort of a consensus. You know, the consensus might be that we use both. The consensus might be that we actually merge, inform, and define into one deliverable. And the consensus might be that we see the different points of view and maybe we table it for a little while and revisit it. So there's lots of different things that we can do to be able to kind of mitigate that risk of people not agreeing. But what it does do is it gives everybody the information that they need to have a concrete discussion where they're answering questions based on information that they're given and not just, well, I think it should be in e-learning because I think it should be in e-learning. You know, people are forced to defend their choices and to provide, you know, kind of facts behind their decision instead of just personal preference. So it really has that rich dialogue. You know, we haven't had many opportunities where there was really a staunch disagreement or a disagreement that wasn't able to be answered at all. So some reminders that we should consider is consider the reuse as a reason to use a more engaging format. So if there's something that you have in a curriculum and you know that you have other curriculums that you're going to be putting together later on in the year or for other learners, you may want to think about creating something that's really dynamic and really cool because you're going to be able to reuse that across the board. Remembering to set aside cards that are used frequently to keep a good blend. So if you find that your learners are sticking with one card all the time, you know, asking them to set that aside and asking them to start thinking about some other options as well, because the only thing worse than taking 15 hours worth of ILT and is converting it into 15 hours of e-learning. That's really just swapping one modality for another. We really want to try and create that blend to keep those learners engaged. We also want to think about the propensity of change and choose easily maintainable formats. So we want to create a training solution that's sustainable for you, something that you're going to be able to edit moving forward, something you're going to be able to keep up to date, because there's nothing worse than a training that's out of date and becomes quickly irrelevant for learners. So there's some other considerations that we should think about as well as we go through this. We need to think about the fact that the learner is not the only person engaged in a training solution typically. So we want to think about the contributor is that learner. So they're going to be the ones who are focusing on that inform or that define phase. They're going to be the ones who are taking the asynchronous instruction, and they're responsible for obtaining that information prior to moving on to some of the next phases of instruction. We also like to engage a role called the learner advocate. The learner advocate is the person who's not a supervisor or a manager, not necessarily a mentor, but it's somebody who's been through the training program before. It's somebody who can help that learner through some of the on-the-job activities. So it's really starting to build that it takes a village mentality for a training curriculum. It's also trying to build that teamwork, that camaraderie, that network that the learner is going to need as a new employee in your organization or someone who's new to the role. So it's a great way to start building those kinds of connections and that kind of camaraderie within your training program so that it becomes a part of that training solution. Within that, that doesn't necessarily have to be something that's in person. That can be social media. That can be, some sort of social learning. It can be through all different kinds of modalities. Last, we have the coach, and the coach is going to be somebody who has more of a supervisor, manager, mentor type of mentality, but they're going to be the ones who are ultimately responsible for this learner. They're going to be the ones who are doing any of those capstone exercises. They're going to be really focusing on that apply. So they're going to be the ones who are looking at this curriculum from end to end, making sure that the learner is progressing properly through it. They're going to be the ones that the learner advocate can go to if there's questions or if they have concerns or if the contributor is struggling with something. So as we start to think through that, we can start to map out where we want these intersections to be. So the individual contributor is going to be, again, at that inform and that define phase. The learner advocate is going to be at the practice. The coach is going to be at the apply. If you see how the blocks are building on the screen as well, you can see that sometimes you're going to have content that's just something that you inform the learner of. It's nothing more, it's nothing less, it's just awareness. Sometimes you're going to have the content that's inform and then define, but there's really nothing to practice. Sometimes you're going to have them practice, and sometimes you're going to have them apply. Rare is it that you don't inform the learner of something before you define it, but you will find that oftentimes that inform and define can come together in one deliverable. So maybe the inform is the first couple of pages of an e-learning module. So I did see a question that says, do you have an opinion on whether it's better or worse if the learner advocate is a direct manager? I oftentimes feel like the learner advocate is best served not being a direct manager. The reason for that is that it's going to be something that the learner is going to be more apt to go to a learner advocate who's not their manager. They're going to be more apt to go to a peer to ask questions, especially if they're new to a job or new to a role. So we really want that person to not be somebody who's assessing them. More so we want that person to be the conduit to information, the person who's going to help them, and the person who they feel comfortable going with to questions to make sure that they feel comfortable with whatever new knowledge they're trying to obtain. So some reminders here. We want to make sure that the content for the individual contributor can be completed independently. So most of this is going to be asynchronous instruction. The learner advocate role is going to engage the entire organization, so it's that it takes a village mentality. Learning doesn't just rely on the responsibility of the learner anymore. We want to make sure that everybody is engaged in that learning so that it's not just an event, it's a journey, and it's a journey that that learner has participants and people to take that journey with. And last, we want to think about the coaching role is really critical to increase manager engagement. You might want to even consider engaging your manager in the training process so that they can start to see some of those good skills, see some of those ways of interaction with the learner, which is going to transfer to on the job as well. So I have another question that says, when going through the rapid analysis, how much consideration is given to the location of the learners? For example, you have 20 learners who are in 6 different locations. Would you eliminate certain strategies based on this? We wouldn't necessarily eliminate certain strategies, but the strategies would look different. So as we think about a lot of those, inform and define, they probably wouldn't look different because they're going to be asynchronous anyway. Some of those practice and applies, though, are going to look a little bit different because instead of instructor-led, we may use like a virtual classroom. We may want to think about how we're engaging the learners because we want to make sure that they have the support in their location. So there are some considerations that we do need to go into from an implementation standpoint. But from a core foundational, what types of modalities we're using, they're actually very flexible to be able to be done, in a single location or globally. So what are the next steps after you go through an analysis session like this? The next step is that we're going to go through and we're going to design the curriculum. So at this stage, we really need to firm up the flow of the content and the tone of the training. Before we go into the design, we're going to take another look at this analysis and we're going to make sure that it's solid. We're going to make sure that as we go through that we have a really good blend of modalities. We're going to make sure that we have a nice pacing to it, that it's something that's easy for the learner to get through, that it's something that makes sense. Oftentimes we're going to, in that design, we're going to start to map out what the learner is going to get and when. So making sure that they don't get all of the different informs and then the following week or the following month they get all of the defines. We want to give them a little bit of the informs, and then maybe the next wave is going to be the definitions of the first informs and then some new informs. We want to phase things in for the learner so that the learner has something that they can chew on, something that's manageable, something that's not going to overwhelm them, and something that's going to increase retention. So we want to make sure that whatever content we're giving them is something that they're going to be able to retain. So again, at this point, we're going to still have the decision maker and the subject matter experts there, but it's more so from a validation standpoint. So as we go into the design, we're really validating what we've done in the analysis, and we're making sure that everybody's bought into what the solution is. Typically, for 1 hour's worth of content, this might take up to 4 hours. It might take much less. A lot of time it depends on what kind of pre-work we have going into the analysis phase, how much thought has been done as to what content needs to be there, what content the learner needs to know, and what shape the source materials might be in. The output of that analysis phase, which is what goes into the design phase, is a design document. So it would be something that elaborates what these different modalities are, and we would really try to start mapping out that curriculum or what that learner experience looks like. Because again, this isn't focused on how quickly can we get a curriculum out there. This isn't focused on, how much content can we get out there. This is focused on what that learner experience looks like, making sure that the learner has something that's going to resonate with them and benefit with them. Now, that doesn't mean that it has to take forever to complete. I'm actually surprised at how quickly some of these analysis sessions go, how much we're able to get through using this process. And then when it comes to the design and the development, then we can start to input a lot of the things that we know about rapid prototyping, about, creating prototypes and then being able to rapidly go through and produce content. But there's lots of different things that we can do with that design phase. The next phase is going to be development. So here we're really fine-tuning that message, the text, and the imagery. So we've already designed things. If we have e-learning deliverables, we might have storyboards already in place. If we have ILT materials, we may have, some draft documentation in place. But really, we're fine-tuning things at this point. We're making sure that the message is clear. We're making sure the imagery is appropriate for the organization. We're really trying to make sure that everything is where we want it to be before we close out this phase of the cycle. Typically, we don't have the SMEs involved anymore. Really, we've gotten the most that we need out of them in the analysis and design phase. So typically, we're working with a decision maker or their designated project manager, or whoever that might be. As we get into implementation, this is really where we're just making sure that the content is going to be implemented properly. As we go into a blended modality like we're talking about here, we need to be very carefully considering how we're implementing this. So not only from a standpoint of how is the learner going to access this content, but how does that look to the learner? So is the learner going into a learning management system and seeing a never-ending scroll of pages of courses and things that they're going to need to take? Or are we thinking through maybe using some sort of a portal, maybe using some sort of a launch page, maybe using some sort of an interactive guide that guides them through accessing the curriculum? We need to think about from an implementation standpoint, and we need to actually start thinking about this much earlier in the process, and it's something we do talk about during analysis. We want to think about what that learner experience looks like to access this content. A lot of times that might mean that we're accessing content that maybe isn't on the LMS. Maybe some of those informed pieces might be on a SharePoint site. It might be something that's on their mobile device. It's going to depend on what that content is and how we need to get that across. So we might be talking to facilitators or instructors at this point. We might be talking to LMS administrators, and we might be talking about, to IT departments and things like that, getting all the content where it needs to be, implementing it, and getting it available to that learner. And last, we go through the evaluation. Now, evaluation is never, ever, ever, ever just at the end of ADDIE. Typically, when I draw out the ADDIE diagram, there's kind of a little tiny E in between each of the rest of those letters. Evaluation is something that we need to do at the end of the analysis phase to make sure that the analysis that we did is accurate. It's one of those things where if you've ever watched like a master painter work, they paint and then they take a step back. They look at it, they make sure that it looks the way that they want to, and then they probably go back and make a bunch of changes as well. Analysis is no different. We're going to have to go back, make sure that everything is the way that we want it to be, make sure we've considered it. Sometimes bring in people who maybe weren't engaged in the session to validate what we have before we move on to the design. Again, in the design, we're going to want to evaluate and make sure that the text is where it needs to be, the images are where they need to be, that the content is firming up in the way that we want it to be. From a development perspective, we're going to evaluate and make sure that everything is developed and it's going to work on whatever devices they're going to be using. We're going to make sure that everything is effective and that it's, we troubleshoot it and make sure that everything works perfectly. From an implementation perspective, we want to make sure, again, the portal or whatever we're using to deploy the content is easy to access, that people have the ability to access the content where they need to access it, when they need to access it. And the final evaluation is really to see if the proof is in the pudding, to make sure that these learners, not only that the learners really enjoy the experience and that they get what they need out of it, so looking at some of those capstone exercises to seeing what the results are and making sure that the training solution we put into place is effective and course correcting as needed, but also collaborating on the process itself. So how was it working with the subject matter experts? How was it working with, any of the design teams that you might be working with, any of the other individuals that you might be working with? Really evaluating not only the training solution, but oftentimes we forget to evaluate the actual process that we've gone through. So is this something that would work in the future? Are there tweaks and changes that we would need to make? Are there modalities that maybe you would call something different based on your organization? The cards can always be customized to support a different phrase, like maybe use podcast instead of audiocast. What changes might we want to make prior to doing this again? So some of the reminders that we want to consider, our modalities are best selected for maintenance, engagement, and reusability. So to go back to that question that someone asked me earlier in the session, whenever we're choosing modality, we want to think about how much do I have to maintain this content, or how frequently is this content going to change? And we want to think about that because there's nothing worse than having content that's out of date or content that's no longer relevant. We want to think about engagement. So how much do we need the learner engaged in this content? Is this just a clear message that we need to get across and it's no big deal? Is this something that we want them to be able to practice? Is this something that we want them to be able to apply to their day-to-day job? And we also want to think about reusability. So as we're creating some of these modalities and some of this content, is this something that we're going to be able to reuse across the board? Are there going to be other training solutions in which we're going to be able to reuse and repurpose this content? We also want to think about creating a blended learning solution, so using the different modalities for what they're best for, but creating an experience, especially for longer or larger training initiatives that are going to provide different types of modalities and different types of engagement for those learners. We also want to find ways of engaging that learner advocate and managers in the training solution, so making that training be a journey and having everybody involved in that journey for that learner. Gone are the days where training is an event, where you go and you attend an event, but training is then over and you never think about it again. While we still may do that, unfortunately, it's not training that typically sticks, and it's not training that's typically effective. So let's think about it as a journey, and let's think about who we want at our learner's side during that journey. And that concludes this presentation. At this point in time, I will turn it over to Kayla And if you have any other additional questions, I believe Kayla's going to direct you to put them into the Q&A module.
Thanks, Sherry. That was an awesome presentation. As Sherry just mentioned, we definitely have time left for questions and answers. So as a reminder, if you do have a question for Sherry, be sure to enter it into the Q&A module at this time. It can be found in the right-hand panel of the WebEx. Also, Sherry covered a lot today, and there's obviously a lot more to discuss. So we encourage everyone to continue the conversation with Sherry past this webinar. You can find her contact info in the slide deck. Right now, we'll also be emailing that to everyone. And then also, she'll be following up with a blog post on GP Strategies blog to address some of today's key takeaways. Also, the recording and the slides from today will be sent to the email address that you provided, and we'll get that to you within about 48 hours. So, Sherry, it does look like there are a few questions coming in, so I will turn it back over to you to let you go ahead and answer those, and then I'll close up after that with some closing remarks.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kayla. So one of the questions we have is, how long does an analysis like this usually take? This is the part that I think is the most shocking. Some of the analyses that we do, one example that I have is we actually took a training that was 3 weeks in duration. 3 weeks worth of content that they were typically getting in either home study or instructor-led training, and we spent 3 days, and they weren't 3 full days, they were actually 3 half days, and managed to get through all of that content and map it out into, I believe, 72 to 79 different discrete deliverables that were going to meet the needs of the learner. Those deliverables reach all 4 areas of inform, define, practice, and apply, and were really engaging to be able to do for the learner. So it really does depend. It depends on how much discussion you have, but you would really see the time be cut down by just going through this process and really focusing on that learner and the content that they need to go to, rather than having a lot of discussions that I think anybody who's participated in an analysis process before knows that sometimes those conversations go off on tangents, and it takes a while to steer everybody back to where they need to be. The next question is, do you have any statistics on the effectiveness of blended training versus traditional classroom and event training? There are lots of statistics out there. I think a lot of it depends on the differences between different styles of learner and also the different types of content. So it's going to depend on what you're trying to convey and whether that belongs in an in-person training or whether that belongs in a blended training. So ways in which, blended training, I think everybody knows and is familiar with the different reasons why you might do that. I think what often falls by the wayside is, when do we still want to do that traditional classroom training? So that traditional classroom training I typically like to see in more of the gray area type content. So whether it be something that's application-based, but the process is, it's not just as simple as follow these 5 steps and you'll complete your process. It's practical application of scenarios and things like that that the learner needs to work through, where you still want to have that facilitator there to answer those questions. You still want them there to be able to talk through some of the challenges. It's where, that traditional classroom is where we want to have a lot of those rich case studies, a lot of that rich discussion, and that's where we can get the most benefit out of that time that we're spending. Again, that traditional classroom-based instruction can also be done virtually, so it's all going to depend on where your learners are, what your travel constraints might look like. But there's often a solution that we can put in place to keep those traditional classroom components for the places where they're going to provide their most benefit. One other question that we have is, do you find that the decisions made in the process are representative of the final curriculum? If I had to assign a percentage to it, I would say the solution that you get at the end of the rapid analysis is probably around 90%. There is typically a little bit of back and forth. The back and forth is either due to, as we start to dive into the content, we may decide that there's too much content for whatever modality, and we may need to switch it up. We may also decide that there's too much of one style as we take that step back and look at the picture that we put together. So we may need to remap things into different deliverables. The other thing that we often consider as we take a step back after doing the rapid analysis process is we may want to merge deliverables together into one. So it may not make sense to have things, while we treat them in the rapid analysis as discrete components, we want to be able to really put some of those together into one deliverable that maybe branches out. So then thinking really through what the learner's experience looks like and making sure that that's something that they're going to be able to understand, and it's something that's going to be digestible for them. We have another question. So how are the 79 deliverables in your example tied together? That's a great question. Oftentimes that learner advocate is really going to be part of your magic to putting a blended learning curriculum together, because they're the ones who can guide them to the different deliverables. But what we typically do is we have guides that go with it. So there's typically a learner guide and there's a learner advocate guide. And that talks them through what those different deliverables look like. It talks them through what they're going to do and when. For the learner advocate, it's going to give them questions that they should be asking the learner, information that they should be giving the learner. If they're doing some sort of a side-by-side, it's going to give them specific examples of what they're supposed to be doing. But it's going to be giving them a lot of different direction on how to process through the curriculum. Now that learner guide, some of the most recent ones that we've done have actually been in Storyline. So it doesn't have to be this paper-based guide. We can actually put a lot of interactions in there that they can fill in information. They can do different drag and drop types of activities as they go through that. But then the activity guide would also direct them to, at this point in time, go to your learning management system and take this course, and come back here when you're done, and let's think through some of what was just covered. Another question that we have is, who do you typically have involved in the process, and how many people are too many? It's going to depend on what the different content is. Typically, we have subject matter experts. We might have business owners. We have different types of people. Maybe we might have a learner. Maybe we might have, somebody who would be in that learner advocate role. So getting a diverse audience to this type of an activity is going to be key. How many people are too many people? I would say 20 would be probably your max. You're going to start to have too many opinions at that point in time. If you have more people that you need to involve in the process, then breaking it out into subgroups would probably be best. And then having your key stakeholders together to reconcile the information and put together the final training plan. So making sure that we have the right people at the table to be able to put that information together. So the cue cards with the descriptions, we don't have those electronically yet. That's something that we're thinking about doing right now. It's actually really great from a discussion standpoint, but we may need to consider that. And if you're interested in the cue cards, definitely when you get my contact information, reach out, and we can talk through what you might be trying to do and give you some guidance on what would be the best approach for you. So at this point in time, I do believe I've answered all the questions. So unless anybody has any others, I will turn it over to Kayla.
Thanks. Yeah, it doesn't look like we have any more coming through. A lot of great questions coming in. So Sherry, I appreciate your quick ability to answer those kind of on the fly. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up today's session. Thanks again to today's speaker, Sherry Weppel. And thanks, of course, to everyone who attended for your time and attention. We hope that you'll join us again.